I am really, really excited today to be talking about direct to consumer brands. It's a topic that I've taken great interest in the last few years in particular. Well, let me back up. I've taken interest in this topic, I suppose, for more than 10 years as a consumer, right? As a person who enjoys quality products, tends to lean in on e-commerce sort of channel purchases. And as a consequence, I find myself, I once made a slide, I was talking about direct to consumer, and I showed an image of myself and I pointed to, my direct consumer top and my direct to consumer underwear and a variety of shoes, mode of transportation. I just sort of outlined the myriad of ways in which I am a direct to consumer brand consumer. And so I suppose I've been in and around this notion from a personal basis, but on a professional basis, as we look at sort of the media and marketing landscape, I find this to be a fascinating trend. And today I am joined by my friend and longtime colleague, Brian Berger, who is the CEO of Mack Weldon. Say hi, Brian.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, Terry. It's always good to hang out.
Absolutely. So I was just thinking about this, Brian. I mean, it's been a dozen years since you and I were hanging out in the offices of Comcast when you were making digital media investments. Yep. And I think we've always had an interesting dialogue about trends and developments in the ecosystem. What I like about, and I was thrilled when you popped up on my radar, at least, as the CEO of Mack Weldon, because if you think about all the aspects we often talk about in and around digital media, often involving, software or some technology solution or data or something, it's very esoteric. It's very sort of B2B and very, very specific. And then you repot yourself into this world of consumer, and all of a sudden, I don't know, we're talking about a lot of the same things, first-party data and all the technical aspects that we used to talk about in the B2B world, but we've got that added element of tangibility, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you sell clothing, and so that just feels a lot more, I guess the best word is tangible to talk about, since it's something we can all touch, feel, and experience.
Yeah, I love that you call that out, because I spent my whole career in consumer internet and digital media companies. And in many ways, that was a big part of the foundation of what motivated me to do this. But it was always really about the passion for the internet and technology as a distribution channel, as an opportunity to connect with customers. But where it always did fall short for me was just the lack of tangibility. You're sort of selling time and space, which is, by the way, a fantastic business model now that I'm in the physical goods business. Exactly. But just on a personal basis, I really found myself getting charged up around brands that really solved problems that were much more tangible, and that could be at the service level or the product level. And so Mack Weldon is very much a product of that.
Yep. And what I like about a variety of these direct-to-consumer brands, we're going to launch into a sort of more formal discussion of what we're thinking about what's going on in the sector. But what I particularly like about it is this notion of the focus on the consumer, but the focus also on the product. Whether it's product design just seems to be, as a category, so much better than the traditional incumbent. I am wearing a Mack Weldon Pima t-shirt as we speak.
Yes.
Because it's like, and by the way, I suppose, you had to be a believer. You have to try. You order one, and your first order, you're like, do I believe the hype? It came well recommended, but I tried one and I wore it, and I'm like, I divide my life into before Mack Weldon and after Mack Weldon. So, it really is a superior product.
That's awesome to hear. And I love that you're highlighting that specific product, because Pima t-shirt has one ingredient, and that's Pima cotton. And our head of design likes to say, you can't outdo Mother Nature when it comes to, you can't out-innovate Mother Nature. Exactly. Many of our products have a lot of innovation in it, So that's textiles and technologies that are blended with natural fibers. That shirt that you're wearing right now is just, the highest quality cotton doing its job. So I'd love to hear that.
Awesome. Well, and of course, I like when I we're going to talk about. I'm going to share my screen now. We'll walk through a few thoughts here, as we usually do on our work from home series, but I'm. Let's see. Let me get that fired up. There we go. Okay, right. Now we've got a good audience. We're going to kick things off here more formally. So welcome everyone to LUMA's Work from Home webinar series. Today is Wednesday. April the 22nd, not the 15th. And we're talking about the future of direct-to-consumer brands. It's a topic that I really enjoy following the trends on because of the myriad of implications on terms of media and marketing, but also from a consumer perspective in terms of, hey, Brian, while I'm firing this up, just give us a summary about Mack Weldon, would you?
Yeah, so we launched the company in August of 2012, and really it was the function of, or the product of, my frustration as a consumer in this category. I already talked a little bit about my professional background, but I really was somebody who was always very passionate about brands that solve problems for consumers, and I always hated shopping for and ultimately the product offering in underwear and socks, and so it's all sort of. My aha moment was one day coming home from work when my wife had thrown out all of my underwear and socks, sort of forcing me to go to the department store and shop for that final voyage.
Right.
And when I was there staring out into the sea of boxes and over assortment, the sales guy comes over to me and says, "Are you confused yet?" And it was really at that point, before all this.
Answer was yes.
Before you could fill up an entire slide with brands at 0.02% font, Terry, that I felt like it was time to really take matters into my own hands. So that was really the catalyst. And over the course of time, we started with sort of the core basics: socks, underwear, undershirts, and tees are the core replenishment basics. And over time, customers have given us license to diversify the product offering into some relevant adjacent categories, which we'll talk about kind of as we get into this.
Awesome. Well, and that's one of the things I like about these direct-to-consumer brands is they tend to do a lot of content marketing, and often the best content marketing is in fact just the story, the narrative behind why it was founded. All right,
good. We're all set. We're good to go now.
All right, now we're good to go. All right, here we go. Future of direct-to-consumer brands. And again, I'm really delighted to be joined by Brian Berger, founder and CEO of Mack Weldon, one of the more premier clothing. Is it just men's?
Yeah, we serve primarily guys, and anybody who shops on their behalf.
Great, men's clothing brand. I know I utilize it and love their product. And it's always good to have an operator, because we're bankers and we like to think of ourselves as thoughtful about trends, but let's face it, that our perspectives are molded, shaped, and informed by dialogue that we have with people like Brian, who are operators, who are on the front lines. Just as a reminder, this is part of our work from home webinar series every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We call it the new version of appointment TV. So every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, we have hopefully an interesting topic in and around sort of media and marketing and technology. And you can see here, we're coming to the end of season 1. We have completed 5 of these sessions. This is session 6. And we're soon to be on to season 2. We're going to be announcing season 2 tomorrow, I believe. And we've got a terrific lineup of both topics and guests. And in fact, next week, speaking of which, I am delighted to be joined by David Jones, who famous for his stewardship of Havas, who for the last half a dozen years has run, you and Mr. Jones, a fascinating sort of brand tech holding company would be my sort of elevator way to describe what they do. Fascinating set of investments and acquisitions in companies that bridge that sort of technology application to creative, which I think is much missing in the marketplace. Okay, here we go. The future of direct-to-consumer brands. Look, there's lots of trends in marketing. In fact, last week with Jeff Ramsey, we had a webinar specifically talking about parsing which trends were real and which ones were kind of BS. And one of the ones that we were both in agreement on was direct to consumer. And look, it's hard to ignore, right? Whenever you have a trend, a phenomenon whereby in a variety of verticals, relatively young companies, newcomers, can garner double-digit market share from category incumbents that have been building their brand in some cases for decades, you're on to something big. It used to be in the old days of marketing, when you had a 75 basis point movement in market share, careers were made and lost on movements like that. Now we're talking, 6%, 10%, 20% in some categories where these, venture-backed young companies have taken share from those large incumbents. It's really fascinating to see just the efficacy of this new channel, if you will.
Yeah, I would just say, there's really three things that I think have precipitated this. The first is, as you mentioned, capital. The second is really access operators, and then the third, and this relates to a lot of the things that you cover, is access to consumers and the proliferation of channels like Google and Facebook to access consumers.
Yep. Actually, here's a controversial. I just said this was a channel. Is this a channel? Is this a go-to-market strategy? It's often direct-to-consumer gets categorized in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's funny. I was having a banter with my good friend Mike Duda, who may be on this call, but we were talking. We talk about this a lot.
We can only hope that Mike Duda is on this call, and we'll be.
Yeah, I know he's a very popular guy. He's a very popular guy. No, but there's really two things. Direct to consumer is a distribution strategy.
Right.
It doesn't define what a company is. Direct to consumer brands have been around for a long time. H&M, Zara, J. Crew, Lululemon. Those are all direct to consumer brands.
Yep.
They just happen to exist largely in an offline format.
Yep.
The sort of digitally native, vertically integrated brand, Andy Dunn coined quote is perhaps more accurate as it relates to these companies. And I would sort of modify it and say, digital DF, digital first, direct to consumer brands.
Right.
And that means that, you may have physical stores, you may have third-party retail, you may have partnerships with other smaller brands like health clubs and hotels, but you're digital first, and that everything you do is generally oriented to feeding the e-commerce part of your business, the direct e-commerce part of your business.
Yep. I agree with that. Although, in marketing, we love our three-letter acronym, so we're going to stick with
we don't have to
either DTC or D2C, but whatever. That's what we're going to stick with. So not only have these demonstrated their efficacy in select verticals, it's proliferated across pretty much every possible vertical, from clothing and apparel to personal care, travel, food, real estate. I mean, there's kind of almost no category that has not been touched by this sort of concept of prioritizing the direct-to-consumer sort of strategy or go-to-market.
Yeah, and again, I'll just go back to my point around access to capital, access to supply chain, and access to consumers. I mean, that is really the bar on a lot of things that were historically really difficult to do, unless you're a huge company with lots of resources, had been significantly lowered and continues to lower, right? I mean, Shopify, when we were starting out, we didn't contemplate something like Shopify as an e-com platform, even though it existed. We went with something much heavier and much harder to manage. Now Shopify's offering for enterprise class e-commerce sites is best in class, and so that just makes it even easier.
Yep. And no doubt led to some of this proliferation. I mean, the ease of venture capital, you had the platforms like Shopify, you had sort of the media, the highly sort of tuned media channels of like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube that all sort of contributed towards this sort of growth. Look, if the space isn't crowded, then it doesn't warrant a LUMAscape. I remember when we first went to put this together, we had a couple of hundred logos. I think we published it at about 250 logos. And rapidly, right, 250 companies sort of told us, no, you forgot us. And our direct-to-consumer brand, LUMAscape, is now over 500 logos. Yeah. And what's interesting here is there's already been over, I think by some counts, depending on how you count it, $20 billion of venture capital funding to support these companies. You get some concentration with, because I think we have like Tesla in here, so that tends to skew the numbers, and Uber. But put it this way, a lot of venture capital is funding this, and we're going to talk about why is an asset class, an investor class who's typically investing in sort of higher operating leverage technology businesses suddenly interested in, shoes and clothing and all kinds of other things. And of course, we also know that the proliferation is increasing, sort of like the scale of application, right? 87 million direct-to-consumer customers in the U.S. in 2020. And I'm going to go ahead and say, if you think about parsing that by demo, the younger people, it's pretty much 100% would be my guess, penetration or something close to it of the younger generation in terms of who uses direct-to-consumer brands.
Yeah, and what we're experiencing right now is actually really that forcing that last customer cohort, the last significant customer cohort over the hill or over the hump is I read a stat that from February to March, there was a 180% increase in baby boomers shopping online.
Wow.
And this is a group that many of which are perfectly comfortable shopping online, but a subset of which, is still reluctant, to give credit card information, to give data, wants to try stuff on, doesn't want to deal with returns. And so coming out of this, that kind of last, remaining holdout group that is really significant for consumer brands to capture is going to be showing up as part of the active population.
Yeah, I mean, I got nothing like a global pandemic to drive discovery for new customers, and I think it's one of these things where once you try the water and it's okay to go in, I mean, really, you're not going to lose customers, right? I think post-pandemic, I don't think people go back to saying, okay, yeah, I've now experienced the incredible ease and convenience of this new channel of shopping. Let me just go back to the tired old and problematic channels of the.
Yeah. It's all about just demystifying the experience, and once you do that, it's you're sort of, the light goes on, and you're like, why would I ever do that again?
I'm going to go ahead and launch a simplistic poll here. It's a simple one. During and post-COVID, during this and once we get through it, do you expect your spending on these direct-to-consumer brands to go up or go down? You know how they normally have like 5 different ones, slightly increased, significantly increased? Forget it. Let's just go with the simplicity of, will it go up or will it go down? I see that, wow, we're getting a tremendous amount of voting. I think I know your vote, Brian.
Yeah, I just voted.
Right, there we go. Yeah, I clicked the box that said allow panelists to vote.
If only political voting was that easy.
Yeah, exactly. So look, guys, it's overwhelming. Go ahead and share the results. So it's 83%. So 71 of the 86 folks who voted on that are expecting it to increase. For the 15 people we're expecting it to decrease. No words. No, I'm just kidding. Lord knows what's driving that. Yeah, look, it's increase in popularity. There's nothing like, a forced situation like this to drive that. I have made the point in talking about this topic that it feels to me like the direct-to-consumer brands have more in common with each other than with their erstwhile vertical competitors. And by that, I mean, look, Allbirds sells footwear just like Cole Haan, and Warby Parker sells glasses just like Sunglass Hut. But I'm going to go ahead and say that from their design proclivities to their go-to-market strategies, their media strategies, their sort of approach to retail, to the extent they have one, have a lot more in common with each other than with the sort of more traditional competitors for whom they're garnering market share. Do you agree with that, Brian?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's a really interesting way to put it. That you look more like these kind of completely different categories than you do your incumbent company or brand that you're trying to disrupt. And I guess there's a playbook, so to speak. So not only in approach to the product and the value prop and the identity and the marketing strategies as you articulated, but in terms of how we all approach the customer relationship, I mean, that really is where a big part of the commonality happens. It's this notion of creating some level of humanity and tangibility to the brand in the mind of the customer. And it's not, and it's real, it's not bullshit.
Well, I think the implications of this, if you do believe in this sort of horizontal approach, it does beg the question: is there an opportunity for a direct-to-consumer holding company or a direct-to-consumer focused private equity strategy that might make sense, whereby either the holding company or the private equity firm gets the in-house, the sort of necessary expertise so as to apply it across a variety of verticals? We know Tim Armstrong is sort of pursuing this approach with his DTX effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea gets talked about a lot amongst operators as well as investors. I think it's been challenging. Mm-hmm. One of the outputs of the kind of overabundance of brands and sort of the situation that we're in and the sort of overall market dynamics we're all facing prior to this happening, the COVID-19 situation, is that there will be some level of sort of shakeout. And I think as part of that, a smart, well-heeled, opportunistic player can come in and really do in many ways what IAC did in the sort of digital, pure digital landscape.
In the travel and dating space, yep.
Yeah, and it really requires a conviction and a real knowledge of the kind of commonalities, things that can be leveraged across, but also what is critically important to preserve brand to brand. And I'll just give you a traditional, like if you look at VF Corp and the traditional kind of consumer apparel, accessories space, they've done a particularly good job at rolling up brands and allowing them to thrive, but obviously rationalizing some of the commonalities to drive more efficient business models.
Yep. Well, I mean, maybe I was jumping the gun by going right to the sort of later stage of holding company and private equity. I certainly believe there are gains to specialization at the early stages, so at the venture stages. And we mentioned Mike Duda, who's a very successful VC focused on the direct-to-consumer brands, and I gotta imagine his deeper dive into the variety of aspects from media strategies to retailing, merchandising, I should say, must have played a role in him identifying which models would work and therefore to that success. So in many ways, I sort of hearken this to something that the folks in the digital media and marketing sort of B2B side of the ecosystem are familiar with. And to think about where we are in the gestation of this trend, I think about, it feels to me that direct-to-consumer today feels like programmatic did in 2009. Back then you had sort of this ecosystem with rapid new company formation, right? A fragmented ecosystem with a lot of venture funding, relatively nascent, consolidation, and a sector poised for significant growth. You fast forward sort of 10 years, and all of those attributes I would suggest apply to direct to consumer. Now, we know how this thing played out in display programmatic advertising. We had a massive increase in spend. The sector 10 years ago was nascent, and now it's got over 85% of all digital ad budgets in display are programmatic, and tens of billions of dollars of spend. That's the good news. The bad news is it was dominated by a couple of players in Google and Facebook. Whereas I think for direct to consumer, it just feels like there's no sort of natural monopolies, and there may be a perhaps broader distribution of outcomes as it relates to companies taking advantage of this space. We do, that comes with a caveat, right? We do have Amazon, which is playing, not only a growing role in the B2B side of media, but also, as a distribution chain in e-commerce now comprises over 50% of all e-commerce. And for B2B brands, I suppose it's a double-edged sword. It could be a great distribution partner, or if they decide to launch a no-names version of your product, then I suppose it could spell trouble.
Yeah, and I'll just say, just adding to that, and what is unique about the right side of the page is that brands get valued based on their uniqueness, on their differentiation. So the idea of, sort of the classic interpretation of monopoly or market dominating brand, like we've seen in the programmatic ad space or other categories, is not quite as relevant. Certainly for a retailer or a marketplace, it's a different story. So I think just, getting brands to scale, and then, what is this notion of a consolidator or sort of a holding company of brands look like down the road, I think is really where we'll see things play out.
Here's a question. Let's grab it live. The preponderance of these logos on the D2C brand LUMAscape are American. They're domestic brands, largely serving domestic markets. That said, when we looked at this phenomenon, it's pretty much global in nature. You've got companies in the UK and throughout Europe, Asia, South America. I mean, what's your prognostication for the globality of these brands?
Well, I think U.S. brands, however we're defining them, DTC for the purpose of this conversation, all the brands on the right side of the page, there is a huge growth opportunity as in terms of thinking about a global market. Many of us are not yet at that stage, but there is a gigantic market opportunity there because the same fundamental realities exist in terms of the value chain.
Sure.
Right now, it feels like each market is pretty. If you're not talking about the marketplaces, brand-wise, it feels like brands are generally focusing on their core domestic market. In our case, and many of the companies on the charts case, it's U.S., Canada, and then maybe Australia, New Zealand, and a few other spots where it's a bit easier to enter those markets, whether it's language or sizing or sort of import-export complexity, that duties and that kind of thing. But I do think you're going to see a shift for sure.
So I think there's two categories, right? There's either international, which is, brands from any particular country selling globally, or there's globally local brands. Like you see brands in Brazil, for example, a large domestic market that, are largely just serving their domestic market, and it's big enough for them.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So I think both things have yet to happen in that there are not necessarily any sort of domestic dominant, multi-billion-dollar public brands in the categories that as we defined it, and there has yet to be one that has essentially exited the U.S.
I'd love to get your feedback on this. We tried to parse, what are the distinctive characteristics of these brands, we come up with what we call our 7 sort of DNA traits, if you will, of direct-to-consumer brands. So number 1 is we believe they're digitally native, mobile-centric. And by that, we mean, kind of to your earlier point, Brian, I suppose these can be omni-channel, and when they scale, they really should be omni-channel, but they tend to be born natively. And perhaps that's one distinction between what we're calling direct-to-consumer in the more modern nomenclature versus direct consumer brands that we've had for decades. And I've noticed that in the case of many of these brands, the mobile channel, people are using mobile as a purchase sort of vehicle. In some cases, over 50% of the purchases are done mobily, just right there. How does Mack Weldon stack up on mobile versus desktop?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. It's probably, roughly 60-40 right now,
Yep.
Leaning towards mobile and growing. I mean, we recently replatformed our site to Shopify, which enables a bunch of things in checkout that make it much more kind of mobile friendly. And that's really the crux of it, right? If you have Apple Pay or Google Pay integrated, yep, or Shopify Pay, which is, really simplifies the process, all those things really enable mobile transactioning in a much more convenient way. To has it historically pulling your wallet out and entering it into small data fields.
Yeah.
And so on our side, we design from a UX perspective mobile first, and then we scale it up.
Yep, and that experience with the consumer is really part of this. I mean, you got to have the product, but you also really focus on the experience, and that's DNA trait number 2, which is focus on the product design. I mean, I just almost like to a category, it almost feels like they're just so much better, right? My direct-to-consumer luggage, it's called G Pro. It is just a superior piece of luggage, even compared to my premium Tumi luggage that I had for years. It's just better. It's just better. They were more thoughtful in terms of how they designed the handle, how they designed the pockets, how they designed the wheels. The whole thing just feels better. It's like this shirt I'm wearing. It's just better than other shirts that I have. So that's got to play a huge role as well.
Yeah, and let's not forget how important that is to the kind of customer connection and the customer marketing, right? A big part of our story and others like us has been the ability to communicate the features and benefits, the uniqueness, the differentiation to consumers in in these platforms where you have very, very limited time and space, right? You don't have to read the details, but if I show you a graphic with a bunch of arrows on it and a dotted line and a map and something that feels really technical, you may not choose to walk out and read exactly what's going on, but you see it and you say, oh, that looks like a beautiful t-shirt, but it must have a lot of technology going on inside of it.
Right.
So whether you choose to dive deeper, the storytelling of the product development piece is a key part of the marketing across a commonality across many. I mean, look at Harry's. They talk about a German factory that they bought that makes premium blades, and who does that? I mean, these guys believed in it so much they bought a factory for $100 million.
Totally. So, and you jump right to number 6, with trait number 6, which is the leveraging content marketing in particular for brand storytelling. And I often find the most effective story is why the founder started the business. You see these female DTC founders, and by the way, can we just call out here? This is one technology channel, one technology sort of segment that has we counted over 30% female participation in the sort of founder and CEO level, which we're super excited about. Finally, and you hear their stories about a bra that didn't fit right, and then they designed their own. They got some engineer to mock something up, and away it goes. And that story becomes a key component of their marketing strategy. So third trait is, just to run through the rest of them, disintermediation. That's obviously that's the D in direct against whether it's all the intermediaries of agencies, retailers, wholesalers, what have you. 4, they tend to be sort of we call it identity focused customer relationship, which is to say not only do they go directly to their customers. They're very data centric, right? So they keep track of who they are. They identify directly, and they personalize their marketing and outreach to them. 5 is they tend to spend dollars to make dollars, which is to say, less about branding overall and more about sort of performance oriented media spend. And I think that trait has sort of bled its way into the general marketing world as people focus more of their dollars on performance media. And then finally, it just feels to me like it's somewhat different talent, right? The nomenclature is even different, right? The D2C marketing person tends to be not called a CMO, it's called a chief growth officer, because they tend to either hire people more directly with traits that relate to business growth as opposed to spending money.
Yep. Yeah, just a more kind of analytical, data-driven mindset. I mean, can't overemphasize the number 4 and just the proximity and use of data to inform decision making. Now, because you could say that about any company, right? All companies utilize data to make decisions, but the proximity to the data and the ability to make adjustments basically in real time to the business strategy is really a unique attribute here.
Yep.
And what has enabled companies, in this consideration set to really scale very fast.
Absolutely. So if we sort of think about some of these traits, obviously here's the disintermediation one. This is pretty straightforward, of marketers going direct to consumer and bypassing a lot of the more traditional intermediaries. We have noted, however, that many have forward integrated into retail or added retail as a component of their marketing strategy. And I suppose there's a variety of rationales here. In one part, you get, more touch points and more, feedback parameters from customers. It tends to be marketing for some of these customers. And then, quite frankly, there's some that I think, like Peloton, or Tesla, had I not walked into a Peloton store in East Hampton or a Tesla store also in East Hampton and actually touched and felt and saw the product, it really would have been a much harder sell to sort of convince you that this thing was different.
Yeah, but super innovative retail. If you just take Tesla, like when you look at one of those Tesla, shops, like A, where they're positioned, B,
Yep.
how you're able to, in this very small format, communicate so much versus having this huge lot full of cars, and the whole sort of traditional model is incredibly disruptive. And and Peloton's done also a lot of things to make their product, to get consumers into their product in a very kind of low friction way, given what the product is.
You're right. When they've done retail, they've really done it on a reinvented basis. Even like Bonobos and the folks that don't carry stock in the store, so it's same as Tesla, right? There were no cars in the crowded pedestrian mall in East Hampton where they had an offering. I mean, they had I suppose they had a chassis with a battery in it, but they didn't have any cars, and they kind of didn't need to. And again, as part of the consumer experience, I signed up for a test drive, and literally 2 days later, they showed up at my house with the vehicle, and I got to take it on ludicrous mode around.
And when you think about how much more operationally efficient that is, it's just incredible, right? They are able to define a new way of distributing cars versus having to sort of back into an existing infrastructure that is quite inefficient. And I would argue a lot of similar things apply to traditional consumer apparel, offline consumer apparel brands, direct brands, than to direct. I mean, just imagine if you have 100 stores, you got to fill all those stores with an assortment of product to cover, 80% of the customers that walk in there. That's like 100 mini warehouses, inventory sitting around all over the place. All of us, we get the benefit of shipping and managing inventory out of one place.
Right.
And distributing it, even if we do have stores, maybe to 5, 10, 15, 20, high volume, high touch retail locations, versus having to reverse into that. Right? Because if you're J. Crew and you've got 150 stores generating revenue and it's your lifeblood, like going backwards, unwinding that, and focusing exclusively on being digital first is just harder to do.
Right.
So,
well, speaking of which, you do have an experiment. You have one store, right, in Hudson Yards. I've been to it.
Yes.
And there's and it's in sort of DTC alley, I call it, because there's a bunch of DTC brands in that newest mall in Manhattan. Yep. What has been? I mean, obviously, talking about pre-COVID, because it's been shuttered for the last month and a half. But what has been your experience so far with retail?
Yeah, Related calls it the floor of discovery, and that really resonated with us, that they were thinking so forwardly about making sure that area of the shops was programmed with exciting emerging brands that couldn't really be found anywhere else. We love that. And it's really played out. I mean, if you walk into the shops at Hudson Yards, one thing that you will see consistently during high peak times is a lot of action on our floor in that area specifically. And whether that's, Blue Bottle Coffee as the sort of food and beverage programming, or camp, and prior to that, blanking on what it was prior to that, but this experiential retail concept to the row of, digital first, whether it's, Mack Weldon or Roan or Amgemi or Stance or, so consumers are flocking there, congregating there. And so it's been great for us. As a first go, we've been super excited about the performance of the store, and we're looking forward to it continuing when things come back to life.
And I'm sure for the last 2 months you were excited to have it only have been one store as opposed to 150.
Yeah, we definitely empathize with folks.
So on the sort of data front again, and this is sort of like a tie-in to the sort of the B2B world, where traditional marketers sort of do advertising in general, sort of without really knowing to whom their ads end up in front of, whereas direct-to-consumer marketers tend to focus a lot more on a targeted approach, using sort of the information they know about their target customers or existing customers. And this is all part of what we call, identity as being core to what we call 360-degree marketing cycle, where if you assume that you want to optimize the consumer experience by sending the right message at the right time to the right person, well, you have to take a 24/7 real-time perspective on the connectivity between planning and data and activation, measurement, and attribution. And I presume I've noticed the tendency of these direct-to-consumer companies to be very data-centric and focused on this kind of opportunity.
Yeah, and it really, really manifests itself a lot on the CRM side, which is once you get customers, like how do you treat them? What's the messaging cadence? What's the type of messaging that you send? What's the testing process that you have in place to make sure that you're getting the most out of that? Because that's the most important marketing, right? I mean, you get customers in, the economics are what they are, but nurturing that customer relationship over time, where bill comes.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, this sort of migration along the performance curve from impressions, or away from impressions and towards sort of business outcomes, has got a variety of benefits to it. In part, you sort of have this effect of changing your sort of discretionary ad spend into a cost of goods sold. We'll talk more about that, because that's all the good news, right? That was the sort of foundation of some of the principles that we've noticed. But come on, not everything is perfect, and there are certainly challenges. One of the challenges that we pointed out from the very outset, talking about this space, is the fact that there's a tremendous fragmentation and proliferation, overcrowding, if you will, of brands in these categories. I mean, it's just impossible, right? The law of large numbers suggests that you're going to see a lot of death and carnage as these companies, with this tremendous amount of competition, not to mention the incumbent brands, who are continue to spend money and have the lion's share of the market. They're simply not going to make it, and whenever you get that, you're going to have a relatively high failure rate. So from the perspective of maybe not consumer, but from the perspective of venture capitalists, if you're looking at opportunities here, you really have to measure twice, cut once, because a lot of these are going to be sort of long shots, if you will, to create real returns.
Yeah, I would say Neil Blumenthal was quoted as saying it's never been easier to start, but it's never been harder to grow these kinds of direct consumer brands, and that's really a function of a lot of things, but primarily 3 or 4 that come to mind for me is the ad arbitrage is largely gone. There's a lot of, as you've articulated, and as the slide states, there's a lot of category overload and brand overload.
Yep.
3, the novelty is not so much. This is not a new sort of phenomenon anymore. And then the 4th, to your last point, is that the capital sources are way more educated now.
Right.
So as a brand starting out and then scaling or proving to an investor that you have something that is more than just one good viral marketing or Facebook campaign away from failure, you've got to demonstrate real knowledge, real command, real traction, quite frankly, across a longer term horizon. And so,
I think all of that rings true. And here's this notion of, look, if what helps you on the way up can hurt you on the way down. So, because there is this tight connection between spend and results, I call it CAC math, right? Customer acquisition cost math. And that arbitrage, that media arbitrage that you spoke of, and that with the net effect of it sort of changing the nature of the media spend expense from being discretionary to a cost of goods sold, that then has implications as you sort of, run out of runway. So a lot of these brands have, maybe started in digital, but have now sort of run out of runway in the sense of whether it's an audience that they've now reached or the expenses, right? Think about that blue line, that the lifetime value line, the orange line, and if you then cost of acquisition goes up, the blue line, at some point you sort of run out of that arbitrage gap that you really need in order to make this a cost of goods sold.
Yeah, and that's where, if you're a brand that was overvalued using unrealistic growth expectations, it's a really, really hard thing to unwind, right? Because the whole the foundation of the relationship to your capital is unrealistic, right? It doesn't mean your business sucks. It doesn't mean consumers don't love it. It doesn't mean there isn't still a huge market opportunity. It's just that, if you're maybe $100 million consumer company being valued at over $1 billion based on growth rates that you achieved, from 0 to 100, and now you're topping out and you got to launch 4-wall brick and mortar to get to that next phase, it's just not going to be the same.
Yeah.
And eventually that music stops. And so I think you're seeing that across a lot of cases now. And a lot of it just gets to that initial surge of excitement around a large segment of the investment community and valuation and growth expectations and all those things.
And look, that's not dissimilar from what happened on the B2B side, right? Where people were able to scale with media arbitrage their businesses, but it turned out that it wasn't sustainable. So in many ways, there's a lot of analogies. Now, I suppose a sliver of positivity here may be one of the effects of COVID-19 will be this blue line, a customer acquisition cost, at least temporarily, is gonna dip back down as the pricing, probably based on lower demand for Instagram and YouTube and Facebook media has abated somewhat.
Yeah, I think you'll see that, and many of us are experiencing that in the sort of immediate term. The only sort of caveat to that is it's really category dependent,
right?
Because in order, media rates going down only helps you if your conversion rates are going up.
That's true. And look, there's been some, and we've had some questions about some of the warning cycles. Listen, no one on this call is suggesting that this is some nirvana. A variety of direct-to-consumer cautionary tales have really manifested themselves just in the last 6 months, right? You had Brandless, which raised a $240 million Series C round just 2 years ago, is now shuttered, right? Shuttered, and that was in a pre-COVID world. And listen, this came as no surprise to me, not because of the company or its leadership. Great people. I was intrigued with the idea, but also scratched my head on how a CPG-oriented direct-to-consumer brands. I never thought those two three-letter acronyms could go together, DTC and CPG, just because of the average order value is so low that I just couldn't conceive of how you could make that sort of media arbitrage work.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Casper went public at a $1.1 billion valuation, and pre-COVID had a valuation of $470 million. That has cut in half since COVID, so even more trouble. But I'm saying an unaffected implication there was that it appears to have been overhyped in terms of its valuation on the IPO markets, which and there's lots of people from Scott Galloway to others that sort of poked fun of the references to it being a tech company. It was not dissimilar from, the pushback that people gave on off the large office rental company we all know and love, WeWork, which was sort of labeled a technology company, and the markets have now obviously concluded not so much.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would put Casper in the highly innovative and disruptive company, still very relevant. Should it be worth over $1 billion with the kind of current unit economics? I'll leave that to the experts at Goldman Sachs, but I still think that there's an opportunity to for that business to be successful and viable. It's just takes a while to grow into a valuation like that. If you look at some of the other players in the category, they sort of approach things a little differently, and I think with varying degrees of success. But Tuft and Needle and Purple are all also pretty interesting ways to approach it. The other thing I'll just add, at least as it relates to the mattress category, because there's been a lot said about it, there's this kind of like winner take all mentality there. Like, why do you need to spend at that level? Why do you need to be that upside down in your unit economics? It's not like, that it's a zero sum game here. These are huge markets as you've articulated. So brands have coexisted in large markets all the time. I mean, look at Nike and Adidas and Under Armour. And so there's also this kind of mentality that like we have to win the entire market.
Right.
When only a small slice of it would still be a phenomenally successful outcome.
Yep. And of course, they're all on the clock, right? Because they all have venture capital funding, and they're all not profitable.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, just look at Lululemon, like in our world. Like, Lululemon's a $25 billion company.
Amazing.
I mean, their market cap dwarfs everyone else.
My top is not Weldon, my bottoms are Lululemon, so go figure.
You know what I'm saying? And they're not operating like if they don't get every sale that Nike got, they're going to die.
Yep.
So it's just this little bit of a sort of a naive and sort of too much of a financial mentality in some of these things that I don't think reflect the realities of the market, at least in the consumer space.
And that our sort of final cautionary tale here is Edgewell, which unfortunately had their Harry's, which had its sale to Edgewell Schick blocked by the DOJ, which was unfortunate. Let's maybe Brian, we're going to pick up the pace here a little bit because I'm just noticing the time. Mike might suggest that direct-to-consumer brands ought to benefit from either partnerships with retail. We've seen some very successful examples there. Transition to omni-channel so that they're not just relying on digital channels with rising media prices, and apply their performance-based marketing tactics to other channels as well. Look, we noticed that there is this sort of crossover phenomenon where people browse online and then go to stores to shop. There's a significant crossover, and perhaps even larger one where they start in retail and then they cross over to online. And I think we talked about that in terms of your experience in retail. It's been interesting to see the proliferation of media spend into other marketing spend into other media channels. We see out of home podcasting seems to be a really popular channel for a lot of these brands, and I think you guys utilize that as well. I think it's that, I don't know, it's a call it a pairing, a perfect pairing of sort of a newfangled brand and approach to the market with a newfangled sort of, media format,
Yep.
which, I don't know, it seems to work right.
Yep. I mean, I would just say, it's more kind of broader awareness marketing, but it also is more of a driver of, as you get into these more broad marketing channels, and even just in the pure programmatic digital channels, the move to offline and sort of alternative channels of distribution is also a way of really rationalizing your marketing spend over a bigger opportunity base, right?
Yep.
There's a high percentage of customers that will never convert on Facebook and Instagram. And so if you show up in Nordstrom, or you show up in their favorite health club at Equinox, or you show up, here and there, you have an opportunity to sort of convert a customer segment that you've already made an impression on.
Yep. And then maybe the biggest channel of that will be television, right? Because television has historically been very undemocratic, right? Not available for smaller marketers, and yet the advent of convergent TV and OTT and the ability to sort of target specific demos and people makes it much more digital-like in terms of the targeting and attribution, which would, by its nature, make it feel like an opportunity for direct-to-consumer brands.
Absolutely. So you already see it. We're scrambling to get there. Now is actually a really interesting time to test because, again, just like in the programmatic lanes, so many brands have pulled out because they're not operating right now. And so it doesn't make sense to advertise. So there's a huge opportunity to test right now. And buying television on a programmatic basis is becoming more prevalent. So we're super excited to try it.
Awesome. And in fact, we have noticed one of the objectives, I guess, of when I came out and started talking about this a couple of years ago, I had a presentation called. I was invited to speak at the ANA, so 3,000 of the top marketers, more traditional, marketers, gathered in Orlando, Florida, and I was lucky enough to be afforded a keynote slot and to talk about the topic of direct-to-consumer. And I decided, for purposes of really overall the message I wanted to convey, and to be honest, for tune-in, I called it "Fire Your CMO," and the notion here was that, look, unless traditional marketers really paid attention to this phenomena, which is not just some fancy three-letter acronym, but that was, very, very material in terms of the implications to their marketplaces, that they would suffer and potentially suffer their way, out of a job. I am pleased to report that in the sort of 18 months since sort of that narrative that I rather poignantly laid out, that there's been massive movement here, and perhaps led by the company that's sort of the poster child for losing market share, which was Gillette, owned by Procter & Gamble, whose chief brand officer is a terrific and very innovation-oriented CMO, Mark Pritchard. Look at what they have done in the 2 years hence. They've made acquisitions of direct-to-consumer brands. They've launched a series of direct-to-consumer brands at P&G. They've made investments in D2C startups with an innovation lab that they've funded. They've taken measures to sort of take control of their data in terms of the technology intermediaries they work with in the ecosystem, and they've even driven more strategies to drive more direct consumer relationships. And this is from a CPG company who historically didn't even know who their customers were because they were disintermediated by retail. So if the objective was to get big marketers to sort of recognize this and take action, well, mission accomplished, I guess, is the banner I'd be flying.
Yep.
And it's nice to see. It's nice to see because I think there's a lot for the big marketers to learn. So if you're a traditional marketer, right, and you see this phenomena taking place, well, you've got three choices in terms of your decisions besides ignoring it, which I'm going to go ahead and say don't do that. So you can build, buy, or partner. And on the partnering side, again, as we mentioned, we have seen a variety of retailers do these cooperation deals, partnerships with direct-to-consumer brands, really as a way to sort of bring coolness to their stores, expose it's a huge benefit to the direct consumer brands because it exposes them to new consumer demographics, and really it just is just a benefit to these direct to consumer brands as they sort of widen their lens of addressable audiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, no question. And I heard a stat that like 80% of commerce is still taking place offline. So if you're, certainly every brand needs to at least be thinking about, being in these alternative
and why
channels.
not, right? Just because more is better. On the build side, companies like L'Oreal, Walmart, P&G have launched their own brands, and here I guess they've sort of taken a page out of what these direct-to-consumer companies have done, hired a bunch of young, thoughtful executives to launch these brands within the corpus of their holding company. And some of these have met with some interesting success.
Yeah, I think it's just the only sort of question. I think in certain categories, I think in CPG and beauty, perhaps, but the one sort of caveat is that so much of the allure of DTC brands is the kind of origin story, the founder journey. You touched on it. It's really hard for a large incumbent player to credibly recreate this, and that's why you haven't seen rampant success stories out here, because everyone says, "Oh, these companies have tons of resources. Why can't they just do it?" And that's, I think part of the reason why.
In my original presentation, I jokingly said, look, it's really hard to build your own brands just because the coolness factor of DTC and the expertise and the incentives. There's a whole litany of rationales, and of course, I'm the M&A guy, so when you're hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I always think was that acquisition's the best way to go, and that's the third option, of course. And we've seen, right, on whether we're talking about the major retailers or acquiring direct-to-consumer brands, or major brands acquiring sort of technologies that almost get them to the sort of the B2B solutions that some of these direct-to-consumer brands seem to be deploying for great success. It really has driven a lot of transactions, some of which have garnered 5x, 10x revenue, really sort of technology multiples, if you will.
Yeah, I would say, and again, it's very, very case by case. I would argue that the value creation of a lot of these acquisitions is questionable, and some of that's public, like writing down Nordstrom, writing down Trump Club, or Unilever and Dollar Shave. But there are others that I think have been really super interesting and kind of right in the bullseye of kind of what we're all going after, which is maybe more like Movado, Movement, or P&G and Native. These are companies that were really filling a gap, and we're in a place where they could really be supercharged, and there was a real kind of more rational expectation on both sides there.
Yeah, we always advise that M&A is like pro baseball. You bat .350 and you're in the Hall of Fame. So look, this isn't not all. They're all not all going to work out, and we certainly seen that here. I think again, if the takeaway here is, look, just don't. Whatever you do, general marketers, don't ignore this trend, right? This is a real trend, and I think there's a lot to be learned from the success, from the tactics, from the go-to-market approach, from the marketing approach, from the just stop at consumer relationship, right? I mean, these legacy companies that have had these almost taken a monopolistic approach towards their customers in the sense that they've ignored them and abused them for years. I think the benefit of how these direct-to-consumer brands have been able to garner market share by treating their customers just better, right? You don't even have to be that much better, you just have to be better. I think I've actually noticed in some cases a little bit of a spillover into these traditional brands where they are taking customer relationship more seriously and implementing sort of a better approach to, treating their customers with respect.
Yep. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
So I guess that leaves us with the sort of the final question here, Brian, is from your vantage point as the CEO of Mack Weldon and one of the leading clothing D2C brands that's had great success in the market, and experimentation in retail. We are going through a COVID crisis right now, which hopefully doesn't last for that many more months. And at some point we get back to some semblance of normality. And by the way, the new normal, may not look like the old normal from a retail visitation standpoint. I guess my question would be for you, given the trends that we talked about, the advantages of direct to consumer, the warning signals and or sort of case studies that we should be aware of. What's your perspective on direct to consumer? If you pull out your crystal ball, do you feel better about the opportunity now versus a year ago? What's your thinking about the future?
I absolutely do. I think again, going back to that quote from Neil. I mean, I think that if you're starting out, there's a new playbook for you. And if if you've been around for a couple of years, as we have, and you're sort of an old timer in the category in some respects, there's going to be a lot of really interesting opportunities and learnings that come out of this. In addition to all the learnings that we've garnered over the last 5 to 10 years playing in this space. But really 3 big themes bubble up for me. The first is shakeout. COVID, the market in general heading into this based on the advertising market. I think there's going to be a shakeout. Some companies, both traditional incumbents as well as emerging brands, are just not going to survive this.
Yep.
So I do think there will be a bit of a shakeout. The second is consolidation. I think there will be really interesting opportunities for incumbents to make acquisitions, to complement their businesses at more sensible and reasonable valuations.
M&A, we love that. We love to hear that.
I think there will be also opportunities for brands to partner, peer to peer. You do this, we do that. We're both, needing to get to that next level. Let's figure out a way to get together on it. And then the third is really breakaway success stories. Companies that have weathered the storm and have sound business models and are poised to capitalize on the new reality and market, the new kind of market realities and customer dynamics.
Yep.
And there are several, larger than us that are maybe poised to do that.
Yep.
And so I think those are the 3 major things that I think, but I'm certainly more enthusiastic than ever about our prospects and, but also sort of very cognizant of the fact that much of the impact of this situation that we're in has not yet been felt at the consumer level in terms of like real significant impact to consumer spending.
Right. And I think if you think about the impact, I mean, it's going to come hot and heavy on traditional retail, right? Yeah. They're going to be impacted more than anybody. And
no doubt.
Lisa Donahue points out we're going to have bankruptcies. I mean, I see a future of a less bifurcated future into it's not going to be a world of black and white where you have, dunderheaded traditional, retailers and brands versus these incredibly enlightened, direct to consumer brands. I think you're going to have this sort of hybrid approach where the most successful direct to consumer brands that, yes, are digitally native, but why wouldn't they want retail distribution partnerships and leverage those additional channels where they can, get new customer discovery that otherwise wouldn't have come from their more native channels, and vice versa. I mean, traditional players can take a lesson from what these direct-to-consumer companies have done, from media tactics to design proclivities to customer relationship approaches, and adopt them, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of cross-pollination here, which net ought to end up with a better sort of retail consumer experience for everyone.
Absolutely. So much of what's plagued traditional retailers and brands is just the fact that it's overbuilt, and to unwind that is very hard.
Well, and it's hard and messy, and it turns out that a global pandemic is going to sort of accelerate. Maybe it's just accelerating what was otherwise going to happen to retail, right? With the bankruptcies and closures. I mean, we're seeing some of these big historical retailers, close. That was happening pre COVID, and now I think that's just going to accelerate it.
Yeah, and so if you're a traditional and you were sick going into this but didn't die, there could be a real opportunity. I mean, think about a brand like Ralph Lauren that is just so iconic and in many ways still relevant. The opportunity to really rethink your distribution strategy, your wholesale, your promotional strategy, all the partnerships that you have that have over time deteriorated in many ways your brand, you now have this huge opportunity to maybe reset things.
Yeah, it is. It's like we have this sort of clean slate moment. By the way, I kind of think I made the comment to someone earlier today. What was the exact wording I used? I was talking to Seth Levine, a brilliant VC, and I said, look, I think this is an opportunity to change how we approach a bunch of things. Everything from from business to life in general. It's almost like a clean slate where we get to sort of say, maybe this global reset challenges our default approaches to how we view kind of everything, right?
Yep.
I know when we get back to the new normal, business travel is going to be different. Events are going to be different as a function of our experience over the, hopefully only 3 months that we were in this sort of weird pandemic period.
Yep.
Where we learned that turns out you didn't need to be in person for everything. I mean, I still believe in the in-person touch points, but maybe not for everything. And I think there's a bunch of commercial real estate I think will be fundamentally changed on the back end of this, even when we're able to, socially approximate again. So yeah, I think you're right. I think a global reset in terms of and maybe use this as an opportunity, right? Say, take this. It's like a silver lining where you're going to sort of say, enough of the downside. Let's focus on what we can do on the positive. So that'll be great. And just any final words in terms of your maybe it's Mack Weldon's sort of goals here as we sort of get through this period and look to what happens post-COVID?
Well, first of all, our clothes are really comfortable for working from home, so I should note that. And the second is that look, for us, we're having to rethink a lot. Think about a lot of the things that we're talking about right now. A big part of our 2020 strategic plan was building on the back of Hudson Yards, doing a little bit more in the physical retail space, accelerating the pace of our third-party retail partnerships, and all that is, there's still going to be opportunities coming out of this. We just want to put ourselves in the best position to capitalize on them. But what that looks like versus what we were thinking in January of this year is just going to be very different.
Yep.
Just keeping yourself in a position to move, I think is really important, provided that you have the ability to do that. And I think for us, we're taking things week to week here. Right now things are more good than bad. But obviously that can change, very quickly with respect to consumer behavior, with respect to fulfillment operations. A whole bunch of things can happen that could, adversely impact us. So we're very cognizant of that.
Maybe as a final question on a recent call, I talked about this need to balance defense and offense. Obviously, defense, you're a startup, you've got cash funding, and if you're not profitable yet, you got to fund your operations. And so part of you has to think about how much do we have in the bank, how bad could this get, how long will it last, etc. So playing defense is probably the first notion that a CEO of a growth company needs to be focused on. And you just mentioned, your sort of scenario planning for in that regard. But then if you've got defense covered off, if you are in a relatively good place and you're fortunate enough to not be, in one of these categories that's getting, almost like zero shutdown, like travel right now, then you do get to think about offense, right? I mean, P&G famously and other marketers have continued spend during down markets and have garnered, picked up market share in down markets, because it's kind of hard to do so when everything is thriving. How does a company like yours think about going on offense during a period like this?
I think that you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we've continued to focus on and expand our programmatic investment, because we are seeing kind of high ROI levels there. We are looking to accelerate our testing of and hopefully scaling of new marketing channels like television and video, which are also very, very, very inexpensive right now and non-competitive, and get some of that learning and hopefully get some traction during this period where there is kind of unusual market dynamics. I mean, those are areas that we're investing purely on the marketing side. On the business side, we are continuing to drive some major aspects of our strategic plan, both around the brand, digital product, data and technology. Those are all big initiatives for us, and we are charging forward on those things with gusto, so that we're more informed and able to drive even harder when hopefully things return to a more normal state.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Brian Berger, founder and CEO of Mack Weldon, thank you very much for joining me for this fascinating conversation of direct-to-consumer brands and their future, given what we're going through. For those of you at home, but do give it a try, you guys out there. Mack Weldon, like I said, Brian didn't ask me to do this. I love their products. I think they're awesome, and I use them every day. So stay tuned next Wednesday when David Jones, the amazing and awesome David Jones of You and Mr. Jones, joins me for a fascinating conversation about what I think is one of the missing things. In fact, there's a touch point here with direct-to-consumer, and that is, we've innovated and there's been a lot of investments in media. We've innovated and made a lot of investments in data and audience. But creative, the third element of every media campaign, seems to have gotten short shrift. And I'm a big believer that differentiating your approaches to creative, and in particular in a manner that is friendly to the consumer and not hostile to the consumer, is going to be a huge opportunity for value creation. And so next Wednesday, April 29th, 2 p.m., right here at LUMA's Work From Home webinar series. Join me for that conversation. For today, I'm Terry Kawaja saying thank you for joining.